It's a summer day in Council Bluffs, Iowa, when the manager of the Best Western Motel receives a call to check on the woman in room 106.
The hotel received a call from her place of employment wanting them to do a welfare check because she hadn't shown up for work that day. At that point, housekeeping staff, along with an assistant manager, went to room 106, knocked on the door, and that's when they discovered the body of a female lying on one of the beds in the room. She was only wearing a t-shirt, and she was lying in a pool of blood.
Police identify the body as that of 32-year-old Lee Rotatori.
She was fun-loving. She liked to ride horses. She tried some of her hand at painting.
Lee studies cooking and nutrition at the University of Wisconsin. She earns a master's degree and then finds work as a dietitian. In 1978, Lee meets Jerry Nemke. Lee and Jerry get married and settle in Nunica, Michigan. In 1982, Lee is offered a promotion.
The position in Council Bluffs, becoming a head dietitian at the facility there.
Lee moves to Council Bluffs with Jerry soon to follow with their mobile home. But just days after she starts her new job, Lee's life is cut short.
They did a sexual assault kit on Lee. Detectives then placed that item into police property. There was not a lot of physical evidence.
Investigators believe that Lee's murder has all the markings of a professional hit.
Some people there reported seeing a male walking in the hall in the area of Lee's room on the evening of the 24th. They described him as disreputable. They said that he was carrying what appeared to be a bouquet of flowers, but they also noted that it didn't appear to be a professional bouquet of flowers. They described the gentleman as a white male, 30s to 40-year-old, medium build, medium weight, dark hair color.
Detectives broadened their search. They turned their attention to Lee's husband, Jerry Nemke, and uncover a bombshell.
It was learned that Jerry was convicted of murder back in 1960. So they start digging into Jerry. After his initial trial, he was found guilty of murder and he was sentenced to death. Jerry filed an appeal. There was a retrial in reference to the obtaining of his confession that he had provided to police at the time of his arrest in 1960. His confession was ultimately thrown out, and even without his confession, Jerry was again found guilty of the murder of Marilyn Duncan. At that point, he was sentenced to 75 to 100 years in prison.
Despite the brutality of the crime and the lengthy sentence, Jerry Nemke is released from prison in 1978, just 18 years after killing Marilyn Duncan.
Why Jerry was released so soon? I have no idea. Getting records of any of this stuff has been extremely difficult. But when you have a guy that does something like this, he was like a poster child for a suspect.
Detectives focus on Lee and Jerry's relationship.
Jerry gets out of prison in 1978. He marries Lee in 1978 within, months after being released from prison. A year or two later, they file for divorce. Another year or two later, they get remarried again.
Lee and Jerry remarry just 6 months before she is killed.
Very quickly, the detectives reached out to Jerry's employers to try to establish his whereabouts for the time frame of Lee's murder. In talking to the owner of the service station, he was able to confirm that Jerry was at work with him in Michigan until at least 10 o'clock in the evening. The same gentleman is also able to state that he personally saw Jerry at around 9 that following morning doing his floral delivery service. There were multiple people who also saw Jerry during the time frame of Lee's murder as well.
Jerry Nemke was 10 hours away when Lee was murdered. By 1983, detectives have run down their last good lead. The case of the murdered dietitian goes as cold as an Iowa ice storm.
The captain comes to me one day and said he was watching a special about the Golden State Killer. He was caught using genetic genealogy. And I was like, I'm totally on board. I didn't have any other options.
The suspect DNA is submitted for genetic analysis, and a long list of possible matches to Lee's killer comes back.
Our initial response was an enormous family lineage. It was literally printed out, and it was 6 feet long along one of our detectives' desks.
They also provided us with a kind of a solvability matrix, a scale of 1 to 5. 1 is, yep, no problem. We're going to find this guy. 5 being, don't waste your time. You're certainly not going to find him through genetic genealogy. They gave us a 4.5 on the scale.
It looks like Lee's case will never be solved. Then, investigators find hope from an unlikely source.
I was sitting at home because of COVID and just Googled cold cases. And one of the first things that came up was the Council Bluffs Police Department cold cases page. I just sent an email, hey, here's a little bit of my background. If you have a case sitting around, I want to volunteer. And I didn't think it would work.
Eric started with a giant list, and he would call us and say, okay, call these 5 people and see if you can get them to willingly put their DNA into the genetic genealogy database.
Eric cross-references the new DNA profiles with public data sources.
I get a phone call from the kid, and he says, yep, I found his great-grandparents or his grandparents. He goes, yep, I think we're going to be able to solve this. That match led us to a group of 4 brothers. It was determined that 2 of them were deceased at the time of the homicide, and that one of them was of such a young age that he was not a viable suspect. We were able to locate a daughter of our suspect who provided a DNA sample, and it was verified that Thomas Oscar Freeman was the name of the individual. Unfortunately, that was followed up very quickly with, oh, but he's been murdered and he's dead.
Detectives scour Lee's case file and find a shocking connection.
Through the gentleman who owned the floral shop where Jerry Nemke had worked, it was learned that in the weeks prior to Lee's homicide, Jerry Nemke had received 3 different phone calls from an individual he identified as Tom or Jim. In the actual week prior to Lee's homicide, the same individual had spoke with Jerry on the phone. It sounded like the guy was coming in from out of town to meet with Jerry, and they had something that they needed to talk about. The telephone call to Jerry from an individual by the name of Tom, connecting with him in the days prior to Lee's murder, that cannot be a coincidence. Not only was Thomas Freeman murdered, he was murdered a very short time after Lee Rotatori was murdered. He had been shot 4 times in the chest. Some hunters found him in a shallow grave on October 30th of 1982, and their coroner estimated that he had been there for a couple of months.
Detectives suspect that Jerry Nemke hired Thomas Freeman to murder Lee, then paid him off with lead instead of gold. Then an anonymous informant provides the last piece of the puzzle.
I got a random tip that came in. A guy who said, several years ago, I was talking to a guy who's good friends with Lee's husband. And he was telling this gentleman how he had hired somebody that he had gone to prison with to kill his wife, that he used the money from her insurance policy to pay him off, that he knew when she was going to be murdered, so he was sure to establish an alibi during the time frame that the murder took place. And then reading how his alibi was just so ironclad, it was like, this is too good to be true.
After a 4-decade investigation, Council Bluffs Police Department publicly announced that Thomas Freeman is Lee Rotatori's murderer.
The bright light in all this is the way it was solved. And hopefully this gives hope to others that their cases can be solved.